So yeah, as Ross said, for my action research project, I was thinking about how I can approach conversations that I was finding particularly difficult in my practice for the kind of 2 years that I've been training and developing as a social worker. And that was a really crucial thing. So I'm in a children's long-term safeguarding team, so mainly children on child protection plans. And so risk, which is obviously a big part of that work. I was finding that actually bringing that up with parents and having a meaningful conversation and me feeling confident to do so in a way that was kind of fitting with my practice values was difficult. So yeah, so as I say, I was feeling kind of reasonably confident 18 months into social work, doing all the other things that you can expect to be doing as a social worker, which, as we know, is kind of a list of everything. So, you know, you're meeting, chairing, advocating, obviously direct work with parents, with children, talking about other kind of sensitive things that seemed kind of fine. But there was something specifically about talking about risk, and that's why I decided to focus on this and try and unpack it a bit more. And through conversations with different people, I realised that actually this wasn't something that everyone at my level or everyone in social work was having the same kind of challenges with. And so I thought it was really important for me to actually stop and think about what it is for me and what it is about me that might make this a particular challenge. And when I was doing that, I decided to use, as you can see here on the right of the slide, a hypothesizing map. So we use hypothesizing maps in my local authority when we're working, well, kind of across the spectrum, but particularly with children who are at risk of coming into care. And I mean, it's quite self-explanatory. There's a hypothesis in the middle, which in this case, it was that I'm finding it hard to have conversations about my worries for children and parents. And then I was hypothesizing about why that might be the case. And I've kind of broadly broken it down into what I was thinking about on the left. So there's things, I suppose, around my own identity and my social graces, and where that might fit with families, and why that might be that I was feeling more uncomfortable or less uncomfortable in certain situations with certain parents. My own kind of experiences in family and what my own family thinks about risk, but also about having difficult conversations and conflict, and whether that might be suppressed, and kind of, yeah, my own beliefs and ideas around that. I thought about my values, so, you know, things like being interested in social justice and empowering families, and how that can kind of feel sometimes at odds with talking to parents about risk to their children, as particularly if they are, you know, potentially partly accountable for that risk. And then my emotions, I think this was a big one that came up for me, which I talked a lot about in my research project. So kind of my anxieties around these conversations, and some sort of sense of guilt and even maybe shame at points, embarrassment and vulnerability, I think, was a really big thing. And my needs, which kind of drawing more from a restorative practice angle, I guess, thinking about my needs as the practitioner and how they're being met in these conversations. So actually, something I felt quite strongly is that I have a need to belong, and to feel that in relationships, and maybe that is coming across in my relationships with parents. And also, I think my understanding of risk was something I hadn't really reflected on previously, but I wondered if there was something at odds with how child protection framework kind of frames risk, and then maybe my ideas about risk, particularly from a systemic practice lens. So this was the kind of challenge as I saw it, which was that I knew I needed to be transparent about risks. That's a really key part of keeping children safe. But I also felt it was really important to be compassionate and understanding with families about how these risks came about. And also confident, because I think that confidence is important to keep children safe and facilitate change. Something I should have said earlier is I used the word parent, but I use that to kind of encompass all you know, caregivers, main caregivers for children, not just biological parents. So just to touch on theory very quickly, this is there's obviously more versions of risk in literature and in our kind of experience and practice, but I've categorized them broadly into sort of theory A, theory B. And I think that theory A is sort of the predominant model of risk in child protection and social work. And it's that risk is always unsafe, it's intolerable, it's something that has a clear cause, can often be blamed on an individual or group. It's reductive to that cause. It's objective, it's real, it's a fact. It's something that we can assess and we can manage it. We can control it if we've got the right tools, and we can ultimately eliminate it. So that's what we're striving for, often through the kind of child protection process. It felt to me, and there was kind of research and literature that I felt backed that up. And then there's this theory B, which I think is more in line with this idea of safe uncertainty that Mason talks about, and perhaps more systemic. And it's that actually risk is more about uncertainty and about the unknown, and us trying to kind of make sense of that. And it arises out of very specific contexts. It's got multiple causal factors, and it's, as I've already said, it's uncertain. It could even be considered to be socially constructed due to coming from different contexts. Kind of defies assessment in some ways, and it's something that can therefore be maybe hypothesized about, but without making kind of claims to factual knowledge, and perhaps it can't be eliminated in that way that theory A might suggest. And so I felt there might be something at odds here between theory B and theory A, and maybe I was more aligning with theory B, with some of my understanding of risk, and so that might also be kind of what's the kind of backbone to this dilemma. So yeah, as I said, I was kind of left in this position where I've got a systemic view of risk, which felt in keeping with my own kind of worldview and identity and beliefs that I was talking about before. And on that view, there's kind of less pressure to control or eliminate risk, which I felt kind of maybe reduced my anxiety as a practitioner, and maybe my confidence to kind of explore that reflectively. But also being curious can sometimes mean being quite grey, and tentativeness can be quite vague, and uncertainty can be quite unsafe. So I was again trying to bring this all in with the fact that I'm trying to be transparent and empathetic and confident, but there still kind of feels some tensions there. And that's when I had the idea of actually doing the kind of self-hypothesizing, but maybe bringing parents into that process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hypothesizing. Won't go into it too much because, again, it's a bit theory. But the good thing about hypothesizing, in my opinion, is that it looks for the positive reasons that problems might be occurring. So trying to remove blame from families, and therefore maybe look at why things are happening, and including as many people as possible, again, to kind of remove blame. It's about curiosity. It's about being tentative and exploring possibilities rather than making those absolute claims to knowledge. And also shared hypothesizing is like an intrinsic part of hypothesizing in systemic practice. And so I've wondered how we could maybe use that as social workers, not just with each other, but with more directly with families in a more structured way. So I actually did this with two parents in the same family. So these aren't their real names, but I'm sorry if it's a little bit blurry. It says Alfie, who's dad, and Hannah, who's mum, and they have two children, Max and Caden. And previous history of a lot of domestic violence between Alfie and Hannah, which had meant that when I first started working with them, there was a non-molestation order, and Alfie wasn't allowed to go to the family home. He wasn't allowed to contact Hannah, and they were on a child protection plan. And both parents agreed to be part of this research, as we were hoping to step the family down to child in need and ultimately close them. So kind of exploring how we could maybe think about what the concerns still were for the children in context of this domestic violence and this relationship difficulties between Alfie and Hannah, and hopefully maybe move the situation forward. So I started by doing, again, a very systemic idea of pre-session hypothesizing, and actually found that the best way to represent this was in a kind of DAISY model, like from CMM. So again, I had the hypothesis in the middle and actually summarised some of my ideas around what might be going on in that, and I plan to take that to the parents, kind of recognising that hypothesising might be difficult for them, but actually maybe if they had some prompts or some things to explore, then that might be a good place to start. And so I started this with Dad, Alfie, and we did the hypothesising map that I used for myself. Alfie is not a naturally reflective person. I think he would say that himself. And so the DAISY model really helped him to start thinking about some of what might be going on. And yeah, we spent actually about 2 hours doing this, and I was really impressed with Alfie for being able to kind of open up and think about different things and talk about things in a different way. I think this was actually more effective with Alfie than I had, if I'm honest, maybe expected it to be. And I noticed afterwards that it kind of changed, I think, how he related to me and how he related to the process. So Alfie had this quite strong self-story that he was the perpetrator of domestic violence, and therefore that he was seen in this very kind of single story way. And actually, I think this helped to move beyond that narrative for Alfie, which, while Alfie has perpetrated violence and there is accountability for that in him, he also needs to be engaged in a different way to kind of move beyond and think about how we can make things safe and kind of address risk moving forward. So I felt that this was really helpful for that. However, there were some things I identified that maybe could have been done a bit differently, and one of them was kind of warming the context and thinking about strengths, because I think focusing just on the risks was quite a heavy session. So when I did the same kind of session with Mum Hannah, I used Madson's collaborative helping map model, and I developed what I've called like a vision map to sort of warm the context, start things off. So think about Hannah's visions for the family, where she wants to go, what's helping her to get there, what was getting in the way, and then had a kind of alternative worry map. And this was more where we thought about risks. So in this obstacle section on the left, that's when we hypothesized about what might be getting in the way. So what might be still perpetuating this risk. And actually what I found really helpful about this version was that in the what is our biggest worry right now, it was much more collaborative. In fact, this was exactly what Hannah said to me, which was that we might go back to cycles of arguments that impact how the boys feel and impact my mental health and ultimately lead to social services getting involved again. And that is exactly what the kind of risk that we were working on was. And I think that this model and having warmed the context a bit really helped Hannah to kind of articulate that. And again, I mean, I won't go through the hypotheses that we actually looked at, but some really good introspective kind of circular hypotheses, which was great to see. And I think it was, and again, it was an emotionally heavy session, but I think it really helped to focus us and kind of move into new direction. And afterwards, I contacted both parents a while after, and they said, one of my worries is that using the visual tools might have been a bit patronising, something that we might do with children. But Hannah said she actually felt it was more helpful doing it that way, and she didn't find it patronising. She understood the aims, and she actually felt that this way created kind of confidence in parents. And Hannah said that she actually thinks this would be something we should be doing at the start of the work with families, partway through, and just kind of revisiting it so that they're included in knowing what we're thinking about the risk, but also they're sharing how they think things are going and their understanding of things, so that this can kind of be checked and thought about with them. Yeah, Alfie fed back that it opened up more of his experiences and that he didn't feel judged. And yeah, he talked about guessing, which is kind of how I'd explained what hypothesizing was beforehand, and he felt that that was yeah, maybe more maybe more empowering, I guess. And he said he felt more in control to actually say, to express himself, and like he was being listened to. So yeah, my reflections were that actually I'd been a bit worried about using visual charts because I didn't want them to be condescending, but they really helped with that transparency that I was seeking at the start of this research. And doing shared hypothesizing and thinking about how to make that more collaborative helped me to kind of hear and adopt parents' language, and using their language as a way of talking about risk, and helping them to understand risk rather than kind of very jargon heavy social work language. I felt that parents and me, we all seem to feel braver in talking about risks using these models, and actually I felt I was able to kind of push further into ideas with parents, and it felt less like there was a power difference in maybe doing that. And this key one that I've put in bold here was it helped me to kind of manage my emotions as well as those of the parent. And I think this is something that surprised me that I took away was the emotional contexts that we approach conversations with as social workers are really important. And I know we focus a lot in kind of mentalization-based practice and systemic practice on the emotional contexts and maybe attachment histories and things of parents, but maybe not so much on our own emotional kind of worlds and how they're impacting specific conversations as well as our broader practice. So I think having that time to really think about specific conversations that you might be finding difficult and why that might be, for me, was the most powerful thing about this kind of process. Yeah, I think there's limitations. I think that it could be that always positively connoting something in a hypothesis can reduce parental accountability, and I think that that's something that needs to kind of be looked at more. Some parents are more or less reflective than others, and that's something I think that shared hypothesizing with parents would kind of need to look at, and how it kind of addresses some of that. I think we have to be honest about the practice context that we work in and how time and resource restraints can impact our ability to maybe do some of this work, and how we can kind of adjust some of these ideas, I guess, to be more fitting in that context. And how we kind of align that with that theory A of risk that I was talking about when that does feel so prevalent in practice. But yeah, that's what I've been kind of thinking and working on. So it'd be interesting if there's any questions or thoughts about any of that.
Firstly, Sam, thank you so much for that presentation. Really, really interesting. And I think from my perspective, really useful to consider, you know, that idea of social workers having difficult conversations and that emotional connection to what is it that creates a difficult conversation. And for you, it was about those conversations about risk, but other people listening might notice other elements of their practice. So really, really interesting. So yeah, please, if you've got any questions, please do add them into the chat, and then I can post them for you to Sam. I suppose, Sam, just before we get any questions, I did ask you in terms of just before we started, how have you are considering kind of maintaining that in your practice? Obviously, this was done through a kind of an action research cycle. How have you found that kind of continuation of these ideas into your practice and the realities that you pose there?
Yeah, I think that kind of practice context is a really important thing to consider, because within the space of research, you have more kind of time to give to these kind of things. Something that I want to take forward is what Hannah actually said to me in our session, or after our session, which was that she thinks this would be a valuable thing for parents to have sort of explored with them at the very start of an intervention with a family. I haven't had any new families since finishing this project, so it's not something I've done in that context, but it's certainly something I would like to. And I guess, again, it's about adapting it to use in different ways. So there's a family that I'm working with at the moment who we're maybe a little bit stuck a year into a child protection plan, and I think that some of their insight into what the concerns are for their children maybe could be developed, and I'm thinking of actually taking one of these models to them and to try and kind of see exactly where they are, and explore, I guess, what could be getting in the way of us moving past that risk as well. So it's quite adaptable, I think, and I think that's what's potentially quite helpful about it. But certainly there's there's difficulties in maybe applying all of it, but I do think that the adaptability is its strength, and it's something you can do even in conversations, and that's something that I have done in conversations with parents, is maybe just trying to prompt them to hypothesize a little bit about worries rather than maybe relying on us to be fixing. It's kind of about taking that step back and exploring.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sam. Got a question just been posted by Claire, who I think must be a year one participant. So she's asking, is it possible for us to use these models if our CSWs and local authorities are in agreement?
I mean, it's just what I've done is essentially adapted some systemic ideas into a social work setting. So yeah, I mean, it's fine to use them if they're helpful. They're certainly not my ideas. I've just kind of adapted them, I guess, into more practical application with parents.
Yeah, thanks. I think what I would say in terms of if you've just started the program and you're on year one, obviously it's feeling a level of confidence, isn't it, in your ability to understand these ideas, I think, firstly, and then to apply them. So I think certainly have conversations with your CSWs, but obviously you've got a number of systemic recall days, so perhaps it might be quite early in your practice, but certainly these ideas, as Sam's shown, are very kind of applicable in your sessions. So yeah, hold on to these thoughts, but maybe develop your confidence before you feel ready. So we've got another question from Chloe. So which I mean asks a little bit of clarity around what was in the middle of the DAISY model, but also how did this impact on how you share concerns, worries during core groups and conferences? So I suppose moving away from that, conversations you're having with parents to more the wider meetings, maybe with wider professionals. Did it influence that at all?
Yeah, that's interesting. And actually, one of my colleagues was looking about something about professionals meetings and not specifically about risk, but we actually said it'll be interesting to kind of cross over some of our ideas and think about that a bit more. I think what I would say to that is that some of the work around exploring the risk would, ideally be done with parents before professionals meetings, so that when you are maybe naming things more explicitly in a core group or in a child in need meeting or in a conference, the parent already has the kind of the recollection, hopefully, of having had that explored with them. So that's not so shocking or upsetting or provocative for them to hear. But I do think that there's ways that we could be more systemic and more reflective sometimes in professional spaces, and I think that that's an interesting thing for a social worker to be thinking about, is how actually we might use some of these ideas and explore and encourage professionals to be maybe a bit more reflective about risk as well. The DAISY model, I can actually go back, sorry, it was quite quick. So it's the risk statement. So it's the problem, I guess, in a hypothesizing process. So in this case, it was that parental conflict might occur again in future, and that could cause the children harm. So a very broad kind of statement, which I then, when I was working with Hannah, actually used her version of a risk statement, because I felt it was something that when I'd done it with Alfie, that he had maybe had a bit of a defensive reaction initially, and I'd taken for granted that even though we'd spoken about this risk before, that he was kind of agreeing with this risk statement. So that's what I put at the centre, and then I kind of grouped my thoughts about that into these kind of prompts as things to explore with parents, to just recognizing that they might not be, they're becoming their own kind of anxieties, and they might not be naturally reflective or in that headspace.
Great, thanks, Sam. Just a final question from me. I think what I noticed very much was like kind of your exploration of self, so your own kind of self-hypothesizing that happened before you actually made any changes to your practice with families. Like, how important was that for you to get a better understanding of self and really explore that in depth, do you think?
I mean, I think for me, that was the biggest and most important step. So while this is about hypothesizing with parents, I actually think that stage and that layer of self-hypothesizing was crucial, and I don't think I would have been able to do. I don't know that hypothesizing with parents on its own would have kind of given me the confidence and to kind of be looking at things in this way. I think it was having that more understanding of where I am coming from, and actually more of an understanding about my own emotions and their impacts and needs and their impacts on these conversations, as well as those of parents. So I think it has helped me, by doing that, it's helped me to maybe be more attuned to where parents are arriving from in these conversations. Yeah, it's definitely something I would really encourage, even if you've got kind of half an hour to think about why it might be that you're finding a particular conversation particularly challenging, before, you know, necessarily going straight in to fix the problem, actually taking time to think about where the challenge is coming from.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sam. I just want to, like I said before, thank you so much for sharing such a powerful and personal kind of project of yours. I think it's been really useful and beneficial.